Okay, so let's talk about the president's trip to Southeast Asia, specifically his visits to Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia. A trip officially framed as a strategic engagement to deepen South Africa's ties with one of the world's fastest growing regions. Now, before we decide whether this trip is value for money, we need to look at both the symbolic and material dimensions of what it represents. Symbolically, the presidency argues that this is part of the South-South cooperation, meaning that collaboration among developing nations that want to reduce their dependency on Western economies. On paper, that is a fair and even necessary strategy, right? We live in a multipolar world now, and aligning with regions like Southeast Asia, which has mastered the art of rapid industrialization, infrastructure expansion, and export driven economies, could teach South Africa a great deal about practical growth. But that's the theory. The real question is whether this trip translates to any tangible gain for ordinary South Africans, or if it's yet just another diplomatic performance stayed at the public's expense. So, Indonesia, the first stop, is a meaningful choice historically and geopolitically. South Africa and Indonesia share anti colonial roots. Both nations have navigated the challenges of liberation, identity, and industrial transformation. But we do have to scrutinize a little further. Indonesia's GDP per capita is roughly 4 times higher than South Africa's when adjusted for purchasing power. It has managed to grow steadily by integrating local industry with global supply chains, not just by relying on state intervention, but by enabling enterprise level productivity. So, if Ramaphosa's visit is about learning or replicating that model, then yeah, there is a potential return. The concern, though, is that our government has made dozens of such trade diplomacy trips before, each with glowing press releases, business forums, and bilateral agreements that never quite materialize into economic traction. For South Africa to gain from this, there would need to be signed enforceable deals that bring capital, scales, or markets directly into South African hands, not just more MOUs that expire within the next election cycle. Then we move on to Vietnam, the second destination, which represents a different kind of opportunity. It is a model of disciplined economic management under a single party system that somehow balances state control with private dynamism. Vietnam transformed from a war torn agricultural economy into a manufacturing and export powerhouse. Its literacy, infrastructure, and trade policies all align toward efficiency and output. So when Ramaphosa speaks about expanding consumer markets and diversifying trade destinations, Vietnam should not be treated as just another friendly developing country. It is a case study in national focus. But then again, one must ask, what exactly is South Africa selling? Because trade is not just about friendship, it's about leverage. Vietnam exports electronics, textiles, and machinery to the world. South Africa exports minerals, fruit, and vehicles. The trade balance between the two remains pretty small, and unless South Africa can insert itself into Vietnam's industrial or digital supply chains, the benefit remains largely symbolic there. We can't keep going to the world selling raw materials and expecting global influence in return. And then Malaysia, the final leg of the trip, is where the political theater of the visit becomes the clearest. Attending the Asian summit as a guest of the chair is not a trivial thing. It's a recognition that South Africa is being courted or at least noticed by a powerful economic bloc. Asian collectively represents over 650 million people and a combined GDP exceeding $4 trillion. So being in that room could indeed enhance South Africa's diplomatic footprint. But there is a difference between presence and power. Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam all grew by doing the hard things that South Africa still struggles to do. Building infrastructure fast, cutting red tape, driving local manufacturing, and holding public servants accountable. So if the trip doesn't include transparent outcomes like trade deals that are signed, investment commitments that are published, timelines set, then all of this becomes just another diplomatic expense disguised as a development strategy. Now, let's talk about money, not just in terms of trade, but in terms of cost. Every international trip of this scale carries logistical expenses that easily run into millions. Air, transport, security, delegations, accommodation, and protocol add up very quickly. And when this happens, while domestic governance is pretty unstable, with both the president and deputy president outside the country simultaneously, it raises questions of administrative priority. Should the head of state be abroad, securing hypothetical partnerships while energy crisis, unemployment, and security failures continue to go unchecked at home? Some would argue, yes, leadership must look outward, build alliances, and bring opportunities in. But that argument only stands if those trips have measurable outcomes. South Africa's problem is that its foreign policy outputs often dissolve into press statements and photo ops, while the local economy keeps deteriorating. The issue of value for money can't be separated from timing. With Paul Mashatile under investigation and the presidency's credibility pretty strained right now, this trip might look like a strategic distraction. The president, confident in his domestic base, would not need to keep validating his leadership on international stages. The optics here matter. When citizens see leadership constantly abroad, it sends a message that international prestige is prioritized over local crisis management. And while Ramaphosa's global persona as a reformed mind, a pragmatic leader, plays well in foreign capitals, it increasingly rings hollow at home, where service delivery and economic performance remain stagnant. But to be fair, there is a long term rationale behind such trips. The global economy is shifting eastward. Africa's future trade routes will likely run through Asian ports and not European ones. Building relationships with Asian nations is not foolish per se, it is pretty foresighted, but execution is everything. The same talking points, South to South cooperation, inclusive development, mutual prosperity, have been recycled since the 1990s. Without a national framework that turns diplomatic statements into projects that absorb local labor and transfer skills or grow exports, South Africa's international engagements remain more ornamental than operational. So, is this trip value for money? The answer really is going to depend entirely on delivery. If the delegation comes back with signed agreements that lead to increased exports, investment infrastructure, or educational and technological partnerships that strengthen South Africa's capacity, then yes, it can be justified. But if the outcome is limited to symbolic gestures, recycled rhetoric, and another round of diplomatic handshakes, then it is a waste of national funds at a time when the country cannot afford political tourism. Oh, goodness me. But ultimately, this trip represents a test of South Africa's maturity in foreign policy, whether it can shift from ideological posturing to practical diplomacy. The nations Ramaphosa is visiting have all demonstrated the discipline South Africa pretty much lacks, which is consistent policy, coherent industrial planning, and a commitment to internal development before global display. If he brings home lessons that can be applied domestically, lessons about efficiency, accountability, and economic pragmatism, then perhaps it will all have been worth it. But if not, it's just another flight away from responsibility, another week where leadership is visible abroad and invisible here at home.